Thanks very much. I'd now like to ask our next speaker to come up, who is Tessa Marshall from the University of Melbourne. So as well as being a medical student at the University of Melbourne, Tessa is also the president and co-founder of the Melbourne chapter of Universities Allied for Essential Medicines. And she is going to be talking about the role of public sector research and licensing in improving access to medicines.
Okay, hi everyone. Today I'll be talking about the UN High-Level Panel's report in relation to public sector research and licensing. But first I just want to give a little bit of background on the organisation I'm a part of, UAEM. So it's a student-led advocacy group with over 100 chapters worldwide, and basically its aim is to just improve access to medicines by campaigning mostly at universities, but also to governments and at higher levels as well, like to the UN. And the Melbourne chapter and also a chapter at the University of Sydney were founded last year, so sort of the first time we've gotten up and running in Australia, so fairly new here, but the organisation has been running since 2001 in the US and also in Europe. So public sector research and licensing was quite a big focus in the report, and that is because public sector funding is really important for a lot of global health issues. Particularly ones, or a lot of them, do not really promote commercial investment and don't make a lot of profit. So, for example, neglected diseases where lots of the main people who are suffering from them can't afford the medicines, and also things that affect both the developing and developed world, like antibiotic resistance. So the problem with antibiotics is that even if you do develop a new antibiotic, it'll only be used for very short courses, used as little as possible to prevent further resistance, and chances are resistance will develop eventually, and all of your research and development, you're back to square one, basically. So issues like this and a lot more is where the public sector comes in and has to sort of pick up the slack. And universities play a huge role in this. Between a quarter and a third of new medicines actually originate from research in a university lab. So, for example, the Melbourne Biomedical Precinct, where I go to study every day, within a few kilometres of each other are 25 hospitals, institutions, research groups, and, of course, the University of Melbourne, all doing biomedical research. They publish thousands of papers every year, have thousands of staff, and perhaps most importantly, almost a quarter of NHMRC funding goes just to this precinct. So the University of Melbourne plays a very significant role and collaborates with a lot of the groups in that area. And if they were to adopt licensing policies that meant that any discoveries from the university were ultimately affordable and accessible, then not only does that impact on the university, but it also impacts on all of the institutions surrounding it. So in short, public sector is really important. And there were three major recommendations from the report. They're sort of shortened text up there, not word for word, but the first was that knowledge generated from publicly funded research has to be freely and widely available. And there's obviously a really big transparency issue in the development of drugs. So first of all, not all trials are registered and made transparent, and even if they are, they may not necessarily be published. They might only be published if the results are basically what a company wants or what the funder wants. So this leads to us making biased decisions without complete evidence and affects treatments down the line. Secondly, it's really hard to tell how much it costs to actually develop a drug. So estimates can range from $90 million to $4.2 billion for developing a drug, which is such a ridiculous difference. And as taxpayers with a lot of money going towards drugs that will affect the public, it's really important to know exactly how much things cost and how they were developed, because then if things are too expensive, the public can call a company out on it and make a change. The second two recommendations are the ones that UAEM tends to focus on, and that is that universities and research institutions need to prioritise public health over financial returns, particularly in their patenting and licensing practices. And thirdly, that their policies and approaches need to catalyse innovation and make collaboration that advances biomedical research and generates knowledge for the benefit of the public. So I just wanted to outline a couple of ways that these could be implemented or have been done in the past. So the report actually gives some examples of how universities and institutions could implement the recommendations and improve research into global health issues. And UAM last year published a report called Reroute, which actually reviewed 81 alternative research and development initiatives. So any of these 81 solutions, there are quite a few that universities could use. One example that I just wanted to mention that's been quite successful is the Drugs for Neglected Diseases initiative. So basically this was started as a product development partnership. $290 million from various funding sources was put together with the aim of creating drugs for neglected diseases. And so with the aim being to create those drugs and make them accessible, rather than with a company, your aim ultimately is to make profit. It's been quite successful. They've had 6 drugs be developed already, and there are more in the pipeline. And they're all hopefully going to be accessible and affordable and not being charged at ridiculous prices. So the next potential strategy that I wanted to outline is one that pretty much every UAM chapter wants to implement at their individual university, and that is a global access licensing framework. So this framework is a document with 6 principles in it, and if they're incorporated into a university's licensing policies, it ensures that drugs from that university's research will be accessible and affordable down the line when they're finally developed and on the market. And the exciting thing about this is that you don't necessarily need really big UN resolutions and treaties or federal governments coming along with legislation or things like that. This sort of change can come just from students at the university and staff as well. Just from public pressure, you can convince a university to adopt something like this. And even though it may seem like a local action, it can have ramifications in far corners of the globe. So I just want to outline 2 success stories from UAM to illustrate this point. So for the first one, I want everyone to cast their minds back to 2001. So HIV, thankfully, was no longer a death sentence as treatments were in existence. However, a lot of them were inaccessible, and many people, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, were still dying of this disease, as unfortunately they are today. One of these treatments was D4T, or stavudine, which was created in the 1960s at Yale and licensed to Bristol Myers Squibb. Now, Bristol Myers Squibb was selling D4T in South Africa for $16,000 a year, which obviously is way too high, much higher than the annual salaries of a lot of HIV positive people in that country. So enter Amy, a first-year law student at Yale, who discovers that it's being priced at such an excessive cost, and she's outraged. She goes to the professor who discovered the drug and finds out that he has no idea that this is happening. So together they launched a campaign with Doctors Without Borders and Treatment Action Campaign and put lots of public pressure on Yale to influence Bristol Myers Squibb to do something about this. And it looked really bad for the university, and eventually they gave in to the pressure, and Bristol Myers Squibb had to allow generic production in South Africa. And this led to a 90% drop in the price of D4T. So all of a sudden, Doctors Without Borders could actually treat the HIV positive people that were turning up on their doorstep, and it saved many, many lives. And so this was the beginnings of UAM, Amy and D4T. This is where the whole organisation started. And in the years since 2001, UAM's had many other successes. Some implementing global access policies just for one particular drug, like D4T, and others more generally. And this has happened at big institutions like Harvard, Oxford, Berkeley, Boston, and many more. The second example I wanted to point out is really exciting just because it's a very recent thing. So Sitezolid is an antibiotic that's currently being researched and looks like a promising treatment for extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis, which is an enormous problem. And the rights to it are with Johns Hopkins University. And after a lot of campaigning by UAM students and by other organisations, with a petition signed by lots of different people, they finally convinced Johns Hopkins University to give their rights for the drug to the medicines patent pool instead of to a pharmaceutical company. And I think the medicines patent pool was mentioned before. So basically, yeah, as a UN-funded organisation, it cross-licenses lots of different patents to different drug developers. So this means that instead of it being exclusively with one drug developer, which would slow down research and mean that ultimately it could be really expensive, now research can be sped up, hopefully leading to an affordable and accessible treatment. So that's basically all I wanted to say. I just wanted to point out that hopefully the panel has a lot of promising material in it. It does focus a lot on prices, and there are also a lot of other barriers to access that we need to not forget. So I guess if you're somewhere in rural Liberia or another country and you can't even get to a clinic or get a health professional to diagnose you, it doesn't really matter how cheap the treatment is because you're not going to receive it anyway. So to just keep in mind there's lots of other barriers. But despite this, like the report, we'll hopefully do a lot of good things. And even if nothing were to come of it, just remember that just as students, as staff, as everyday people, we can make changes that may be local to our university, but could have a really big impact. So yeah, check out UAM if you're interested. Thank you.